guys, welcome to my channel. I'm the Savvy Daughter and I hope y'all are having a great week. I'm so glad that you're here today. I've got some information today to share with you guys on growing your own tomato crop. I think this will help you guys grow tomatoes in your own garden, and while I share that information with you guys, I've got a few tomato plants, including this Cherokee Purple, that are just dying to be planted in my own garden. So I've got to get to planting today, and I've got some tips and information to share with you guys that I think will be helpful. So come along with me. Let's get started. Now, when you're thinking about growing your own tomatoes, the first thing you need to figure out is what kind of tomatoes you want to grow. There are 1,000 different kinds of tomatoes and they all do different things. I certainly don't have information on each and every tomato variety, but what I can do is tell you guys about the 3 tomato varieties that I'm going to be planting in my own garden this year. It might help you guys start thinking about what kind of tomatoes you want to grow. The first kind of tomato that I've got is a Cherokee Purple tomato. Now this is an indeterminate tomato variety. There's a determinate kind and there's an indeterminate kind. Determinate tomatoes get to a certain size and they produce a certain number of fruit, and then genetically they are designed to die after they reach their max point and they produce their fruit all at once. Whereas indeterminate tomatoes will just keep growing and growing and growing and producing until they get killed off by cold weather. So indeterminate tomato varieties have the chance to get really big, whereas determinate varieties will generally stay a smaller size. They'll produce their fruit all at once and then they'll die because that's what they're genetically designed to do. The main reason that I want to plant a Cherokee Purple tomato plant is just because I think they're neat. They produce fruit that is the color of a deep leg bruise. It almost looks black. It's kind of a dark color. It's not like really clearly purple, but I would call it more purple than any other color probably. Another interesting thing about Cherokee Purple tomatoes is that they are an heirloom kind of tomato. And I want to explain really quick what an heirloom tomato is. Basically, an heirloom tomato is a plant that is open pollinated. There's a male and a female part inside one singular plant, so it can be pollinated by bees or by the wind. Inside the little flowers, it'll just pollinate itself and produce its own fruits. It has everything it needs to pollinate itself. That's one thing that an heirloom tomato has. And another thing is that it has been around and it's been a tomato staple for at least 50 years. In the mid-1800s, tomatoes became a staple food in American households and in their kitchens. So in around the mid-1800s, a ton of American families started growing tomatoes in their gardens. And for a long time, there were just natural varieties of tomatoes, whatever everybody could get. After World War II, when shipping really boomed and it became advanced, all of a sudden the need wasn't for American households to grow their own tomatoes, but it was for people to invent a new variety of tomato that would ship better than just the standard tomatoes that everybody had been growing for a long time. Because typically the tomatoes that just families grew, while very tasty and flavorful, were soft and they didn't last for a long time, so they weren't good candidates for shipping. So scientists started trying to figure out how to genetically modify tomatoes to make them better for shipping. They came up with new varieties, and then all of a sudden the catalog stopped selling seeds for these old varieties that families loved. So unless families just saved their own seeds, some tomato varieties just went extinct, and it became really hard to find certain varieties that families wanted. After several years of these new genetically modified tomatoes being really popular because they shipped better, people started complaining about these store tomatoes losing their flavors. You know, I can just picture it now, everybody being like, well, my grandmother used to grow tomatoes that are way better than what's in the store. So then catalogs started bringing back old tomato varieties, and they would have these specialties in the catalogs that were labeled as heirloom tomatoes. These became really popular. There are still a lot of people today that swear by heirloom tomatoes. They believe that they're more flavorful, they believe that they're juicier, and that they're just better than non-heirloom tomatoes. So anyway, it's really interesting. Now for tomatoes, you're gonna want to plant them pretty deep, pretty much as deep as you can, because along the tomato stem, tomatoes have these little hairs that come off of their stem, and these little hairs will produce roots if you plant them deep into the ground, because the purpose of tomatoes is to spread their fruit out as far as they possibly can. So if you just leave a tomato alone and let it do its natural thing, it'll get big, then it'll flop over. The place where its stem touches the ground will grow roots, and it'll spread out more like a vine than go up straight like a bush, like it will if you train it and you support it. So tomatoes don't want to stay in one place. They want to spread out, and that's why roots will grow from their stem. But if you bury a tomato pretty deep in the ground, then if you cover up some of their stem, these roots will grow out underneath the ground, and it'll create a stronger root system for the tomato to be based out of. So generally, you want to plant your tomatoes as deep as you possibly can. I mean, you could just leave like a couple of inches of this tomato sticking up from the ground, and it would grow into a whole new plant, because all of this bottom part would just turn into roots. That's something that's really unique about tomatoes. And make sure that they're planted in full sun. Tomatoes need a ton of sun, and put them in organic, well-draining soil, pretty much like you would a lot of other garden plants. So last growing season, I spent a good chunk of my time working on amending soil in my garden, and in this bed where I'm going to be putting my tomatoes today, I worked really hard on amending its soil, which is why it's covered in straw right now. It's been covered in straw all winter. Last summer, I destroyed 100 hostas into this bed. I tilled them in so that it would help improve the soil, and it's done a really great job. I made a good video about that too. I called it like something like destroying 100 hostas to build living soil, or something like that. I have a real good feeling that my tomatoes are going to grow well this year. The next variety of tomato that I have to plant today is black cherry. And yes, I'm going to just lay them down because they keep falling over because it's pretty windy. I'm going to just mosey down my bed somewhere between 1 foot and 2 feet. The amount of space that you need to leave between your tomato plants is going to greatly differ depending on how big the varieties of tomatoes that you're planting are going to get. I don't care if my tomatoes like touch each other. I don't really care if they get big and crazy. So I'm going to just plant them relatively close together and see what happens. But if you guys want to keep your tomatoes like really nice and neat, and you want to prune them really nicely and train them in a certain way, you may want to space them out a little bit farther apart. But for me, I'm going to just come down my bed just a little bit, mix in some of my compost, and get to planting one of my black cherry tomatoes. That's going to be kind of funny. I'm going to have some dark looking tomatoes this year, but that's what I wanted to do. I just wanted to have some interesting tomatoes, something that was kind of different, so that's what I'm doing. If y'all want to grow some more traditional tomatoes, then do that, but I just wanted to do this. He looks pretty good. Now he just needs to go in the ground, and again, I'm going to bury him pretty deep, because just like Cherokee purples and all tomatoes, he has little hairs up and down his stem, so that roots are going to come out when I bury them. You see, for the majority of plants, if you pile dirt up their stem, they rot. That's the case for almost all plants. But tomatoes are an exception to this rule. That's one reason that they're kind of cool. Similarly to the Cherokee purple, a black cherry tomato is an indeterminate variety, so it's just going to keep growing as long as it can before it gets cold. Black cherry tomatoes are a small tomato variety. They're bigger than like a grape tomato or a cherry tomato, but they're definitely not the size of a typical tomato variety, so I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to like them or not. I've never tried a black cherry tomato, but that's one reason I wanted to try it, because I never have before. So I'm just going to go ahead and plant my last one, and then we'll be on to our last variety of tomato. I'm taking off the lower branches of my tomato just so that they don't get buried and they don't touch the ground. You don't want the lower branches of your tomato plants to be resting on the ground. That makes them prone to diseases, and it's just a really good way to prevent tomato disease if you'll keep their very bottom branches pruned off so that they're not touching the ground, especially if you live in a wet, humid climate, which I do. We're doing good. I've got my Cherokee purple tomato planted and my 3 black cherry tomatoes. So the last tomato plant that I have to plant today is a Roma tomato. I wanted to plant a Roma tomato because these are my mom's favorite tomatoes. She really likes using them when she's cooking, because when you cut them up, they don't have like ample juice. They really don't have that much juice with them. So she likes to use them when she's cooking because they don't make a huge mess. Now, Roma tomatoes are really interesting. There's actually some major debate as to whether a Roma tomato is an indeterminate tomato or a determinate tomato. Botanically speaking, by a botanical definition, a Roma tomato is a determinate variety. The reason for this is because it supposedly grows to a certain extent and then it produces all of its fruit at once and then it's done. But practically, everybody that I've heard that has grown Roma tomatoes has said that this doesn't really happen. Like, Roma tomatoes don't just produce all at once and then they're done. I don't know why I took that out yet. Gotta do compost. They've said that Roma tomatoes don't actually produce all at once. They actually do it a little bit more spread out than the botanical definition says. So they're somewhat determinate, somewhat indeterminate. I really couldn't find a straight answer to this question. It's just really interesting how people debate about it. But one thing about Romas is that even though they're not an heirloom tomato, they are open pollinated, which means that you can take their seeds and save them for next year, and they will produce more Roma tomato plants. They'll produce an exact copy of the parent plant. And some tomatoes that are not open pollinated, you can't do this with. You can't save their seeds and expect to produce identical plants the next year. So you can do that with Romas. Something that's really funny is I can see hostas popping up all over this bed where I just planted my tomatoes from where I dumped them all in here to amend the soil from last year. They're still surviving, even though it seems like I've chopped them up with the tiller and pulled them up again and again. There's still hostas surviving, and it's really funny. All of my tomatoes are planted, at least for right now. I've got one more Cherokee purple tomato that I'm going to be planting later for the purposes of another video, and y'all will just have to wait and see what that is. It's going to be a really interesting experiment that I've got coming between two Cherokee purple tomatoes. For right now, I've got all of my tomatoes planted. The final thing that my newly planted tomatoes need is some tomato cages to provide support. Now, these tomato cages are left over from last year's garden. They're a little bit beat up and all of that, but they should do their job pretty well. And all they got to do is support a tomato plant. So there's many different ways that you can support your tomato plants, and all of them will be perfectly fine as long as your tomato plants get the support that they need. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. My tomatoes are now planted, so I get to watch them grow. I've got a long growing season here where I live, so these tomatoes have the potential to produce many tomatoes this year. I'm just excited to see how they do. I hope that this video was helpful to you guys, and maybe it gave you some ideas on planting your own tomatoes and growing your own tomatoes at your house. Really, tomatoes are simple to grow. It's not hard, and one of the cool things about tomatoes is that even if you do a whole lot of things wrong, chances are they're still going to produce some fruit for you, because tomatoes are just really hardy and they're resilient. They want to produce because they want to get their seed going again and produce new plants for next year. That's their job. So even if you don't do everything perfectly, chances are you're going to get some nice tomatoes to eat. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I hope it helped. I'll see you on the next one.